So let me actually pull up what I prepared here. I didn't prepare very much. So my sort of plan is to just like chat a little bit about analytics engineering and this blog post that I wrote now a little bit over a year ago, which feels like it feels both like a really long time because it was like a totally different world a year ago, and also like not that long. Like, it was written in January of 2000, published in January of 2019, right? So that actually wasn't that long ago, but yet now it feels like when I first brought it up, it was a thing that like, people were talking about, I think a little bit around the margins, but it wasn't like a huge topic of conversation. And now it's sort of blown up into this thing where lots of people are talking about it. I see tons of job posts about it. And so that sort of, that rapid change over that time period has been really cool and really interesting to see. And I'm really curious to hear from all of y'all, about what your experience has been over that time, and just how things are changing and sort of where the direction is going. So I think what maybe is interesting is to get a little bit of history of my experience with analytics engineering. And I think where that starts is when I was working at Harry's, where I was building and running the analytics team there, which involved, data warehousing, as well as doing some like machine learning, data science, plus business intelligence, like the normal mix of things. And I sort of realized pretty early on that we had this need for an analytics engineer, something, that had roughly those capabilities, someone who would be on the analytics team working with us, sort of pursuing our goals, and not necessarily being on the data engineering team, but had, software engineering skills. And it was a real battle with my organization to actually be able to hire for that role because no one had ever heard of it before. Everyone from other organizations was like, analytics engineer, what does that mean? That doesn't exist. When they were trying to like look in our Radford data for comp benchmarks, they were like, this role doesn't exist. No one's ever hired for this before. Like, you cannot hire for this role because we're not gonna just like make some role up. And I had to really go back and forth for a long time with the leadership team and the HR team to try to explain to them why it was so important and why it was different than both a data analyst or a data engineer. And so sort of after going through that experience and sort of talking with lots of other people who were having similar experiences, I wanted to write this blog post about just what is, why this role is so important, and like what it actually means. So that way we as a community can, both, talk about it and push it forward, as well as educate other people who maybe aren't as sort of deep into it as we are about, what this role means and why it's so important and why it's valuable in order to be able to like, help us get resources from our organization or better educate other people who we're working with about what the role means, and why it's going to be valuable for the organization. And so that's what led to that blog post. And really, I think the core points there are straightforward, right? It's just in the old world, we sort of had analysts and data scientists on one side and data engineers on the other. But in the last maybe five-ish years, the infrastructure that analysts and data scientists need to do their job has gone from being, has really, the amount of technical know-how that you need in order to operate those tools has increased a lot. We see everything is sort of based in Git. Version control is super important. We expect data scientists at least to be writing R and Python, writing a lot of code. Everyone has to know SQL. Everyone is expected to be able to write code in a way that 10 years ago, a data analyst, it would just be very unfamiliar. 10 years ago, data analysts were doing a lot of Excel. You could be a great data analyst and only know Excel. I think now we see a lot less of that. We expect our analysts and data scientists to write a lot of code. And so the sort of engineering level that an analytics team needs to be able to support has gone up a lot. And that, I think, need of being able to do that is what sort of spawned this idea of an analytics engineer, which is someone who understands analytics, understands data, understands how data want to be used, but also has the software engineering capability to help us build tools that are useful and maintainable and sort of bring the software engineering best practices to the analytics team, which I think is really cool. And it's a really, I think, fun world to be in. And I think we're all sort of learning a lot about the way that role can operate and how it can be a force multiplier for analytics teams. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's really exciting to see all of the job posts coming out where people are talking about this, and people have been sort of really pushing this role forward in terms of thinking about, what does that career path look like? What are the sort of things that actually make a really good analytics engineer? And I'm really excited to see where it goes and to see this role sort of still continue to develop into, a well-recognized specialty. We're going to have books coming out. We're going to have conferences coming out where people are really talking about this. And that's something that's really exciting. Both for me, like as a practitioner, I consider myself an analytics engineer. It's exciting to like get to see other people doing this same sort of work and getting to learn from them, as well as just seeing, how much more effective we can make this world of data and analytics through the development of this specialty. So those are like all of the remarks that I prepared on this topic. I'm really excited to sort of hear from all of y'all about sort of what your experience has been. We now have a lot of people in this Zoom call. I'm counting like, I don't know, 15 or 20. So I'm not exactly sure the best way to sort of manage this conversation. And Claire, I didn't do this before, but Claire, I'd be really curious to hear like from you, especially what your thoughts on this are. I know that you've done a lot of thinking about this. And then maybe we can sort of bounce around a little bit and chat. And if we need to, we can sort of branch off into subgroups to talk more about any topics that might come up or that people want to cover.
Okay, well, I'll jump in, I guess. I thank you for throwing me under the bus there. But I too have written an article about analytics engineering. So I guess that was that was what I was thinking of.
Someone else who has thought a lot about it.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of what Michael just said was similar to my experience. I was the analyst who was only good at Excel, and then taught myself the command line and Git and new SQL as well. Was one of those people that would write SQL and then save the like bookmark. Like I would write it in a web editor and then be like, okay, save this query, this exact URL. And then next time someone asks me for it, I've got the URL to send it to them. And then ultimately, like when that query had to be updated, that URL would become out of date and nothing would work. And so when I learned version control, it was like just crazy that like this tool had existed for so long and was so directly applicable to the work that I was doing. But yet no one that I was working with had said, hey, why don't you use Git for this? Though that being said, I was working by myself for quite a while. And I think like part of the reason for that, like why I was doing things in Excel and things like that is because like a lot of people in analytics tend to come from non-software engineering backgrounds. They come from like operations. Like I studied civil engineering. I then went in, like worked for a startup in like an operations role, learnt SQL there and came over. So like I just never had the exposure to these software engineering tools, and was like completely self-taught / taught by Google. Didn't know the right things to search for. So it's really cool to see like a practice coming out of like, this is like what we consider the best in class way to do these things. Whereas I think before there was no like standard, like gold standard of this is what a really good, like this is how a really good analyst or analytics engineer works, or like what a really effective data team looks like, because it was just like so tied to the technologies that people were using. So yeah, I remember reading Michael's post in January of 2019 and feeling very like seen. Like that's like, I'd given a presentation 6 months earlier where I wrote my title as data something, because I was like, I don't know what I am. I'm like, not an analyst. I don't actually spend time building charts. I spend time like building transformations, which are not charts. Like they power the charts, but it's a different thing. And so I'd given this presentation and written data something. So as soon as I saw that like analytics engineer title, I was like, yeah, like that's what I am. So thanks, Michael.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've gotten a number of emails from people who like literally just write like, you just described my job in a way that like I've never been able to before.
Yeah.
And that's been like super validating for me. And like, I think a lot of people had that feeling of like, oh shit, I got hired as an analyst, but like, I don't do analysis. Like it's been a year since I've done an analysis. And so what does that mean? Like, there's this like career ladder, like chart about things that, make a good analyst, and I don't do any of those things, but like, so what is it that I do? And I think, there were a lot of people who were having that, like a lot of people who had sort of a natural, I think, inclination towards doing software engineering work, but had never been trained, as you said, Claire. They ended up on these analytics teams, and they were like, well, someone needs to do this work. Like, someone needs to figure out how to set up DBT and like set up GitHub, and a lot of times it would just be an analyst or a data scientist would just take that on and start doing it. And it would be really valuable work, but really valuable work that the organization didn't necessarily value or didn't necessarily understand or hadn't planned for. And so I think that I see that so many times when I talk to different people who are in this role who are like, yeah, I started out like not being hired for this at all. And then I just sort of fell into it as the needs kept coming up. And I think that that's a thing that lots of people have gone through.
Yeah.
I'll sort of open it up. Does anyone in here, have questions about analytics engineering or just like thoughts about the role or observations about how it's worked in your organization, or even, in particular, I'm interested in like ideas about where it's going or what we need as a community. Like what are things that we sort of collectively, everyone on this call as like people who are leaders in the analytics community, like what are the things that we should be thinking about for analytics engineering? How can we be supporting junior people? How can we be helping more senior people progress in their careers? I'm really interested in all of those sorts of questions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to pop in. So something that's interesting at my company right now is we're growing our data org, and we actually just created a new function called Data Warehouse Engineer, which in many ways is similar to the analytics engineering role, except that it's sort of like a centralized function. So they're more concerned with like data infrastructure that is shared across all of the different teams that we have. And then there's an expectation that individual data analysts and data scientists will also do some analytics engineering on their own as well, because they are all embedded in like an operational team or a product team that they work with, and they're responsible for the aggregations that are specific to those teams. It's interesting, since we are growing pretty quickly now, like previously we've screened pretty hard for people who have some sort of like software engineering skill, even for analyst roles, but now we're hiring people more on like their domain expertise for certain types of products or operational concerns, and we're getting a lot of people who have no software engineering skill who are suddenly put into a role where they kind of need to understand those concepts. And there's like a little bit of tension where it's like, well, why do we have a team called Data Warehouse if they're not doing all the data warehousing? So it's interesting. It's being considered a part of like the idea of analytics engineering anyway, is being considered a part of like the core skill set of an embedded person, even as there is a centralized team that is largely the clearinghouse for the most important shared resources.
So I'm curious to hear about like, what are those things that are like, where is that line sort of drawn in your organization? Like what things are the data warehousing engineers responsible for versus what things still like analysts are having to do that are super technical?
Right. That's a good question. It's something that we are constantly negotiating. But a lot of it is like the data warehouse team takes sort of like the raw events and then creates like semi-refined events, which we internally call fact tables. So it'll be like, this is a materialized table for like page view events or like whatever other transactions might happen on the site. And then those, some of them are like completely shared across all the different product teams within our company. But some of them are like really specific aggregations where it's like, okay, there's like a notion of a commenter who's very successful in commenting and gets like responses for the thing they put on the site. And that ends up being owned by the specific product team for which that is a KPI. But then like commenting in general is considered like a core thing that's shared across many different product teams. So it's sort of a notion of like, how useful is this to the company broadly? And if it's something that like many people are using, having it live in data warehouse is a way of standardizing the definition and the metrics calculated with it.
And so your analysts are still having to like write a lot of SQL, I guess, to like add in that additional layer on top of that.
Yeah.
And then, it sounds like the problem is that one problem is that you want to hire analysts who are not super technical, right? And there are lots of reasons why you might want to do that.
Or maybe their value add is like deep knowledge of a particular product space.
Right. And like, I actually think that that is something that I was really trying to open up on my team at Harry's. We had on the team some analysts who were very good analysts, but they weren't super technical and they didn't really want to be super technical. They just like wasn't interesting to them on their career path. They were like, this is fine, but like, I don't really want to learn how to code very well. Like, I don't care about learning how to use Git super well. Like, they just weren't interested in it. And it was great. Like, they were really good at working with their stakeholders and working with people in the company and helping them think through, analytical challenges and answering analytical questions. But like, one problem that we were having as a team was that before we had the analytics engineers, they were getting pulled into doing this work that didn't interest them and wasn't in their skill set and didn't match very well with like both what they were really good at and where they wanted to go in their career. And that was a huge problem for us. And so I really think that like that's something that's important for an organization to think about, is like, what are the types of people that you want to hire? And then like, how are you going to be able to support them? I think you can totally hire lots of analysts who, aren't super technical, but they need to have enough people sort of who can help, work with them to get them then the data that they need to do their analysis without having to write a lot of code for it. And so,
Right.
That's what I think about.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that makes complete sense. What ratio of analytics engineers did you need to have to analysts for that to be like a good model for you?
I think it's really tough. I mean, we had 3 analysts and 2 analytics engineers, but I think that like the way that you start probably isn't how you scale. But I mean, I think you have to have, it's hard for me to imagine having more than like 3 analysts to an analytics engineer if the analyst job is doing a lot of like BI stuff, right? Like, because they're just going to need to have a lot of code written. Like, someone is going to have to write a lot of code in the data warehouse or to get data out of the data warehouse in a meaningful way. And because of the nature of analytics jobs being like very varied over time, it's just hard for me to imagine 3 people who only know Excel, with more than like, they're going to probably need a 3-to-1 ratio is what I would guess. I haven't actually done this. I'm curious, does anyone else have any thoughts on this? Because it's been a while since I've worked at a real company. And that was also like a while ago now. So I'm curious, like, do other people have experience with this or thoughts on that idea?
I mean, I can speak to, I work at Chewy and we've grown significantly in the past couple of years. So I've watched our Tableau implementation was about 100 people when I joined, and now we're at 1,400. So we've grown significantly. And we've had to really scale the way we do things and the way we work, because we really wanted to push out self-service analytics to our user groups. We wanted to stand up individual business intelligence organizations within each of our business units. But what ended up happening is the business units would go out and they would hire their domain knowledge, and they'd hire these people that didn't have any SQL skills, and they would annihilate our data warehouse, and they would write these terrible queries. So for my first year, it was pretty much, we were teaching SQL to all the different organizations throughout the company, and we were getting them resources and teaching them how to build projections in our Vertica system, and like just going about the work of bringing these people up to speed. But what we've seen is that once we got those core people involved, and everyone within those organizations was understanding how to optimize queries and how to work better with our resources, they took on that role. And we don't do that anymore. We don't do any SQL training for our organization. They do it all internally, and they can handle it all internally. But what we have seen is that we shifted away from building like content and building stuff for them and to a much deeper support role. So we consider our team a data enablement team. We'll build content for executives and new projects that are being built, but really our role is not as an IT development team, but now we work to enable the business to build whatever they need. So we leverage NIME heavily to help them learn how to build their own data pipelines. We have a data quality framework that we allow them to use so that they can implement their own data quality tests and not have to leverage and rely on a big team. So it's really where we're going right now, aiming to build the tools to make data and analytics and all of those kind of software engineering things easier for them to use, so that they can just submit JIRA tickets and their stuff will be migrated, and it'll automatically apply data quality. We'll automatically look at their queries and what the cost is of those queries and deny them if they're going to come and bring down our database. So we've definitely seen a shift as we've grown and as people have come in, where the people that I hire are no longer Tableau engineers. That's no longer what I look for. That was exactly what my job description was when I first hired. And now I'm looking for, we call them BI engineers. We have data engineers on our data engineering team, and they handle all of our semantic layers. So anything that gets used cross business units or is for finance, or anything that's very highly confidential. They'll handle that, but we really want our business teams to build out their own content, build out their own data marts, and we'll support them in doing that. So it's very much a learning and training organization is what we've turned into.
So I've got a question for those analysts that are on the business teams that, you know, we're learning SQL and now know SQL, like how technical are they? Because like, you know, you've got people who are like really, really, really good at SQL. And then you've got, you know, I know some analysts who are like good enough at SQL to like sort of get some data out and then do what they need to with it. Like, how do you think about, you know, where they need to be, and how do the business teams even think about doing that hiring and training? I'd be curious to hear more color on that.
Yeah, I mean, we had a big discussion a couple of years back about teams needing to hire to have SQL understanding and stuff. And I guess it really depends on the infrastructure that you have within your organization and what your ramp up time is. Because for us, it was like, at this point now, I don't care what your SQL level is. Our system is robust enough to handle it. We have specific tables and projections that are built for those teams to use. We have a data catalog that collects all the queries that our users write so they can go and compare what their peers are doing. So I don't really care anymore. We cared a whole lot earlier. It was much more important that people had quality SQL skills when we were smaller and when it was effective.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's awesome. Like that seems like the place that everyone wants to get to, right? Where you can hire analysts who don't have to have super high SQL skills, so don't have to be super technical, and can in fact be domain experts, or even just like analysis and presentation experts. I think that like that's the dream of where you want to get to, because those people are, I think, easier to hire. They can be domain experts. You know, they don't have to be like really interested in software engineering. And like I think that, but exactly what you're describing, all of this tooling that goes around that I think you need to enable those people to be able to actually work efficiently. That's the stuff that is really important, and that's the thing that I think, like, that's the idea behind analytics engineering, BI engineering, whatever this thing is, or however it's called. Like the idea of like enabling other people to be able to use the data really effectively is really what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, we're really super excited about how we're going to be leveraging Snowflake, because we're just building out data marts for our individual business units, and they can just query a big table with a couple billion rows in it and pull back whatever they need in under 2 or 3 seconds. And it's a perfect self-service platform, and it's really inexpensive. So like those kind of solutions, because we have a big push for lots of different BI tools and things coming into the environment that we're constantly fighting against. So, you know, being able to roll out very, very fast, you know, new technologies and new tools quickly to the business units that are trying new things and coming to us saying, hey, help us find a solution to this. It's really been helpful having Snowflake there as well.
Michael, it's really cool to hear your organizational structure. I'm still kind of going back and forth on like data engineer versus analytics engineer. How does that play out within your organization?
Well, our data. Oh, sorry. Oh, we're both Michael. Yeah, that's good. You go.
Our data engineering team is much more technically sound in there, and then how they're building tables and how they're building relationships and building out that ETL process. They're a much stronger technical team than our analytics teams. I look at our analytics engineers, my BI engineers, as jack of all trades, master of none. Like they're not going to be ETL engineers, but they're going to be able to write Python. They're going to be able to use KNIME to build data pipelines. They're going to do data validation testing. They're going to use Git. They're going to use Tableau. They're going to be able to sit with business users and walk them through their problems, which is probably the biggest thing for me is having our users, or having my developers, be able to easily sit with business users and take in their requirements and solution for them. Because we want to move our technical business, or our non-technical business teams, away from solutioning problems, which is something that they've done a lot in the past, and that's how we get these kind of weird little shadow processes that no one knows about that break all the time. So I guess really the distinction for us is overall skill set and what their responsibilities are. Like, I'm not going to have one of my data engineers go and sit with our business users and gather requirements. I'm going to put a TPM on that, or I'm going to put one of my BI engineers out there. They're just a little bit more customer facing.
Cool. And kind of to Kate's question, what are your ratios?
It depends, because the business side teams are incredibly varied. You know, some of them will have people that have master's degrees in data science and PhDs in data science, and then on the same team they'll have someone who's just an undergraduate who came from the customer service team who's a phenomenal performer. So it's really a mixed bag. I don't really have there's not really a ratio. It's really about what each team needs and then building out the mixed skill sets to support that. And I think that's one of the other things about my team is I have 2 Splunk engineers. I have folks who came from big companies and small companies and a varied experiences, so that they're able to come in and kind of bring a different element to the table.
So wait, are the BI engineers embedded in different groups? Do they sit in sort of a central team? How's that structured?
I own the IT BI team. So, and then there's analytics orgs throughout. So we have an e-commerce, supply chain, merchandise, and customer service. So there's other analytics teams built out throughout our organization that we support. And that is our primary role, is to support them and ensure that they can do whatever they're trying to do and help them solution out whatever they're working against.
I'm just wondering, sorry if I'm interrupting anyone. Really, just based on this discussion, I'm getting the sense that we think of the role as kind of a support role, and that we're always supporting the analysts or doing something to support the rest of the business. So I'm wondering if you can see the analytics engineering play out as more as maybe in a smaller organization, but more of a self-sustained role. So in that an analytics engineer would do something on their own from start to finish. In terms of
what we had a couple of years back, we had started with the idea of when our individual business units weren't strong enough to really build the content on their own, they were coming to us for a lot of support. We had the idea of building out a BI or a IT side BI team whose responsibilities were to pretty much act as a roving consulting group. So we would do 2 or 3 week engagements with different business units, and we would have all the tools that we needed to build out whatever pipelines we needed, database, could build whatever security groups we needed, and had access to anything we needed to go out and doing it. And we rolled it out for a little while. For about 3 or 4 months, we had it running, and our business teams absolutely loved it. Like, it was free resources for them. We would just rove around and say, hey, finance, you need some support? And we'd go and we'd work for 2 or 3 weeks for them and build them a, start to finish product and deliver it. And it was super, super fun. Everybody on the team loved it. But we couldn't gain enough traction with our leadership to keep it going. And headcount was always a problem. But it's a really great way to do it if you have the skill set and the leadership support to go and launch that kind of internal consulting group. You can push through problems much faster than the people who are in the weeds, kind of slogging through it while they're still dealing with their day-to-day responsibilities.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. When I was at Harry's, this was a big thing that our analytics engineers did. In addition to like a lot of the help with the data warehousing stuff, our analytics engineers were also building software that was used internally for lots of different reasons. It was generally like data and analytics adjacent, but like we built a tool that allowed other teams to upload different CSVs and Excel files into a system in order to get that data into the data warehouse. This was sort of like in the days before is like a bunch of off-the-shelf tools existed for that. But like that was a product that they sort of conceptualized and built from scratch and pushed forward, and then were able to launch and deploy and get integrated with the different teams. And the other thing that they did was they did tooling for our machine learning and intelligent decision-making systems, which again is another place where I think that analytics engineers can play a really valuable role. Again, it depends on like the type of organization you're in. If you don't have data scientists or machine learning, then like they're not going to do less of that. But our analytics engineers were thinking a lot about like, okay, how are we going to deploy a new model, right? Like thinking about, okay, we need to have a load balancer in front of this model, and like doing all of that sort of work, which again is very deep sort of engineering work. But you need to really understand also like how this thing is going to be used. What's the difference between deploying a machine learning model versus deploying like a typical web server application. So those are like some of the other areas that I see analytics engineers getting involved in and being productive in, that again are sort of like in these like weird gap areas that data scientists and analysts work in.
I guess I'm just wondering what the difference is then between an analytics engineer and a data engineer. In your article, you pointed out that a data engineer is more skewed towards ETL and activities like that. But at least in my experience, the data engineer that you're describing is essentially what the analytics engineer is that you're describing as well.
So I think it depends a lot on your experience. This was my experience. In my experience, the data engineers that I had worked with, a lot of them were not doing a lot of, well, they were doing like ETL, right? But a lot of like old style ETL. Like they were, implementing pipelines, right? They were really interested in, how do we basically like re-engineering Stitch and Fivetran. They were really interested in like, standing up a Kafka cluster, thinking about, it's a lot of what I would call like building pipes about moving, blobs of data from point A to point B and like making sure that they get there correctly, but not thinking about what the data actually mean. And so that was for me the big difference when I was looking to hire an analytics engineer was needs to be someone who understands the data and cares about what they mean. It's not just, we had 500 bytes on this side and we still have 500 bytes on this side and they have the same hash, so the job is done. It's like, what do these data actually mean? Is this going to be useful for the business? Someone who's much more oriented towards business value, and especially like understanding the data and analytics side than what I've seen with data engineers. So a lot of times they're very super deeply technical people, but really at the level of like, really, writing a lot of, what were they writing? Writing a lot of Java, writing a lot of like, again, these much more deep programming languages rather than writing a lot of like Python and R, and sort of more user-facing things. That for me was the difference, but I know that other people have had different experiences.
That's kind of similar to the way it is at my company as well. We have a data engineering team and a data warehouse team, and data engineering is like writing event collectors and enriching data. They mostly work in Scala. And then our data warehouse team is a combination of Python and SQL and Airflow, and they're much more concerned with the business logic of the data that we're collecting rather than just making sure that events are like validly formatted and arriving to the right place and that sort of thing.
Right.
So is your data warehouse team then your analytics engineers, or do you think of them as something different yet?
Well, I mean, when we spun up the team, analytics engineer was not a term. They're definitely more in the realm of analytics engineer than they are of like a data like infrastructure engineer, which is what I would call our data engineering team. That being said, like there is still analytics engineering done by data scientists and analysts, even though the bulk of it is done by the centralized data warehousing team.
It's interesting because we're kind of talking about the overlap of domains. And of course, when you have like small teams, you might just have like someone who's engineering focused and someone who's analytic focused. And as you grow, you can start to fill that out more. And so like analytics engineer does feel like it's fitting this middle ground where like, I know Joe and I have some similar experience, and we had that same where it was a data engineer. They did care about the business logic. They did work on the models and enrichment, even sometimes making analysis. But then there was also the person that was mostly focused on analysis. And so having that, but that was a small team. And so I can see how as it grows, like even pushing data engineering more towards software.
Well, I mean, I like these distinctions, though. The subspecialties, I think, are attractive in the sense for you could put your finger on, I think several years ago, well, I mean, if we rewind all the way to even the late 90s, 2000s, I mean, I would argue that people were inherently analytics engineers when they were writing macros in VBA, in Excel. I would make a very strong argument that might have been the first analytics engineer. Yeah. But it's interesting seeing it evolve. I mean, if you harken back to 2010 and Drew Conway's Venn diagram of what a data scientist is, and it's interesting seeing how that's evolved. It was like hacking and stats and domain expertise. And now, if you looked at where that progressed, that basically was, most of that work was data engineering. And then that subspecialty broke off. And I think it's good that you wrote this because it puts a finger on something I think a lot of people were kind of wondering. Well, I mean, data engineering is such a large overlapping term as is data scientist. I mean, I don't even know what the hell data science means anymore, frankly. And like, because most jobs you see now are like an analyst position is advertised as a data science position. So it loses a lot of meaning in that sense. So I'm glad that these subspecialties are coming up. I think it'll be, if you have more finely grained titles, hopefully there's less ambiguity. Because I think there's a lot of overfitting with terms. So
yeah, that's assuming everyone's using the terms the same way, of course.
This is a very strong assumption. So
I mean, I think that's a part of the problem is when you look at job ads or descriptions, it's like a data scientist can be all over the place. And now we just keep adding more terms, and what do they mean? There's just no standardization, and you have to read the detail to know, or even talk. Yeah.
And a lot of these job titles are honeypots too. I mean, they're meant in such a way that you can attract talent. usually in large quantities, and then you just throw them into whatever job you happen to have that may or may not be related to the title. So it happens.
I suppose that the team and company size kind of dictates this, but I'm curious, are people assigning analytics engineers to specific departments within the organization? So like an analytics engineer who's only focused on all things marketing data, or are they more generalists? Are you seeing success with one way or the other? Thinking about hiring for my team, so just trying to plan that out.
I can speak to how we hire with our hiring specific people for specific domains. We have historically hired for general purpose people. We just hired our first financial person who will sit on my team and be solely dedicated to a single business domain. So we got to that need not because we felt that there was a need on my team to have that skill set, but because the organization that we were supporting wasn't investing appropriately in their own headcount. So we had to, and we still headcount from them and invested for them. But that's kind of where we went, because they got to the point where they were just over leveraging my team, and I finally got to the point where we said no more, and you need to give us headcount, and that's where we went, because it was just a matter of we couldn't continue to support their need. So I think there's value in hiring those individual people, but if it's really about a headcount consideration, can you spare having someone just dedicated to a single area?
Right, makes sense.
Even in my company, I think we have found success when analytics engineers have worked closer with the business people. It really builds context on the data if you don't have previous domain expertise. That has worked generally very well, because then they own that mart, so to speak, a lot. But you do need a core set of, and this happens at DBT Slack a lot. People discuss like, what about a core DBT package versus different DBT packages on top of it, which model fits well, where you can have highly technical people, just like the data warehousing team that was being mentioned, or also just like core analyst engineers, and then you can distribute them. But you do need the core before you can distribute them. Otherwise, people will diverge, and then it'll be hard for data engineers to support all of them. That's one way to think about it.
I also think having sort of a core reporting structure seems like a good idea, to keep people from feeling isolated and to help support the actual analysts and create some continuity, where you have that sort of like hub and spoke it's sometimes described as, where you have your central team and they actually are all reporting to one, but they have particular areas that they focus on, or business units. Now, I think though that that Michael, who was talking about his organization, has something rather different, and it sounds like it's working well for you, where they are actually totally isolated teams outside. You don't necessarily have the centralized model, which is interesting.
It's a mixed bag. We suffer from different teams rolling out different stuff that we don't even know that they're doing. So they'll have pipelines and processes that are just not communicated out. So we struggle with governance. That's our big hurdle right now, is just keeping track of everything that the different teams are doing, making sure that everybody's margin matches up with everybody else's margin and sales figures and all that kind of fun stuff. So governance is a huge problem when we have siloed people.
Would you put analytics engineers or your BI engineer essentially in charge of governance, or do we hire somebody that's like governance, data governance is your whole job?
Up until about 5 hours ago, I didn't have anybody for governance, so we just hired our first governance person to do exactly that. So we just got to the point where it was too much for any one person to wrangle all the teams to help document and define everything and document their processes. We needed standards, and rolling out standards across business units is practically impossible unless you have someone with teeth who can roll.
So how's that person being set up for success?
I'm sorry, say that again?
How's that person being set up for success?
By direct engagement with our CTO and his support, saying this compliance organization is defining the way that we are going to work with data, and that they will have the clout to define new standards and new processes that teams need to follow. That was really the main area where we needed to go and set up a data catalog to get everybody communicating and getting everybody pulling together all their information to a single place. And then we're launching governance to sit on top of that to go and reach into the business units and guide them towards a nice standardized approach to consuming and using data.
So this governance person, I'm very curious, like, what is their background? Are they like a former data warehouse engineer or something, and they're coming in and they're going to help with this? Or
spent
like
8 years rolling out governance and compliance, including a global GDRP implementation. So that was, we were originally not looking for someone with quite that extensive a resume, but with everything that's going on right now, the market is kind of a little bit more robustly populated with good individuals. So we were able to take advantage of that.
Cool. I'm really curious how that works out.
Yeah, me too.
I've always thought the danger with governance, right, is that it just becomes a roadblock and it slows things down. And so figuring out that balance of like organize and empower, and then like have minor roadblocks where they're really appropriate, but then take like, like that, I think is a really hard balance to get right. It sounds like y'all are like definitely thinking about those things, but I'd love to hear how the journey goes and what you learn, because I think it's a thing that more people are going to be thinking about as I think this world pushes forward, where we have better tools for more self-service, which then empowers more people to build a lot of stuff. And then like, oh shit, what is everyone doing? I think that's like a really interesting, it's a signal of our success collectively, but also like that's gonna be, I think, a big new problem for us to think about.
We rolled out self-service analytics without giving two hoots about data quality and governance, and it's been painful. And then rolling any kind of process into there, and then pulling back those and adding controls on top of people has been incredibly painful. If you can do it right from the get-go and put in the controls from the start, it's so much easier. But yeah, getting 1,000 people to change direction and all of a sudden migrate into production with the data quality testing is not easy.
I'm curious, as you're like starting to roll out a governance role, do you think you'll rely more on carrots or sticks in terms of getting people to use like the blessed resources?
I am a stick person, but the person I'm hiring is a carrot person. So I'm hoping that there's going to be a good balance. I've been told that we can do it with carrots, and that's my intention. And we really want to utilize we have a good Tableau background, so I can provide excellent visibility with my Tableau team to what's going on within governance, and we can gently shame and congratulate teams that are participating in a way that we want or don't want. So that's kind of where I'm looking at it. The person I'm bringing in is very vocal and very charismatic, and going to hopefully ingratiate themselves to those business teams and drive movement. But well, that's to be seen. We have a lot of difficult partners to work with.
I wonder what the future is for a role like analytics ambassador then.
What does that role mean to you?
I mean, it's kind of what you just described, somebody who can work with the organization to, I guess, make analytics more successful, make data better. So maybe a governance person, but it's kind of a weird word. So yeah.
Like a developer advocate for analytics, you mean?
Yeah, like internally, yeah. I see like the biggest challenge is, I mean, we do a lot of consulting with like, tons of companies, and I think the major challenge inevitably comes back to people. It's got nothing to do with technology. That's like, the easy part. It's everything to do with herding cats.
Ain't that always the way?
It's immutable. So, yeah.
So, Michael, I wanted to know, so do you have a problem with like multiple answers to the same question, or, no single source of truth? Is that part of it?
No, actually, we were fortunate in that there was a data governance effort that went on about 2 or 3 years ago when I first started, where they defined about 300 core terms. So a lot of the kind of heavy lifting of getting the finance and supply and merch and marketing people all into the same room and everybody coming to an agreed upon definition was done a couple of years back. So from what I've heard and talking to a lot of the governance people that I spoke to, was that is one of the most painful processes. And it was. I sat through those meetings 3 times a week, 2 hours at a clip, trying to work through definitions, coming back week after week after week. But now we have clean definitions that are defined by SQL and business knowledge, business definitions that are documented out there, so that anyone wants to know how we calculate revenue, it's very, very clear and very defined, and here's a query that'll do it.
So what are the problems now? Like, you just have so many things going on.
Yeah, it's just we're rolling out new verticals and new departments pretty rapidly. We're just trying to keep track of all the new changes that we're doing and all the different teams that are being spun up and projects that are kicking off. It's just providing visibility is the hardest thing. It's just keeping track of everything that teams are doing. So it's all about getting more and more automation to stop having it be a manual process of keeping a master list or anything. It's got to be, everything has to be automated through, we use Jira, but.
So pivoting a little bit, career trajectory for an analytics engineer, right? In your article, Michael, you said analytics engineers, like an analyst who has more inclination towards engineering. Do you view somebody like this actually moving towards data engineering eventually? Do you view like a software engineer becoming an analytics engineer because they have more software skills and then moving on to analyst work, or like some of those career trajectories that cross maybe roles? Like, how do we see this? Is this a stepping stone? Is this the final place that somebody sits and is like, I spent 25 years being an analytics engineer?
I mean, to be honest, like I sort of hope the latter. Like I'm really excited about this being like a practice on its own where people can, do it for a very long time and get better and better and better at it and, continue to add a lot of value and not necessarily need it to be a stepping stone into something else. I actually, as of right now, like I think that that's true. Of course, the industry is like changing super rapidly. So it's really hard to know where we're going to be 10 years from now. But like right now, like I see people who can get really, really good at software engineering with this specialty in analytics, which covers, data warehousing and potentially machine learning tooling and some of these other things that have been touched on here. Like I can see it being a thing that people can just get really good at. You could have a staff analytics engineer a couple of years from now. I think, I'm really curious what other people think about what the career trajectories for these people might look like. Because I mean, for me, like it just like hasn't been around long enough for me to like I haven't seen anyone be an analytics engineer for more than 4 years, just because like I feel like it's been that new, at least we've been sort of calling it that. But I'd love to hear from other people like what y'all think or what you've seen, or if you are an analytics engineer, like what your personal aspirations are. I'd be really curious to hear.
I was just going to jump in with, so about 3.5 years ago, I was hired as an analytics architect, which was like a new role. I think it's analytics engineer, but I don't know, more senior or more from the data architecture side. Or maybe it's the same thing, I'm not sure. But like coming from IBM, like you kind of move up, when you move into an architectural role, that's kind of a little more senior and you develop solutions, you maybe work more with the business or doing proposals. So you're not always doing technical coding every day, but that's sort of a way of becoming more senior in a technical branch. Otherwise, sometimes you move into, I suppose, managing a team of analysts or analytic engineers and data scientists.
Yeah, I think that pattern works for a lot of career ladders where maybe there's like a terminal level of like you're some sort of senior and then you have additional special levels that are for your principal and your staff people. That tend to be like even more beyond just like you're really good at executing technically. It's like you start being someone who advises on architecture or someone who's largely responsible for tech leading or mentoring a lot of people. I think that pattern works just as well for analytics engineering as it does for traditional software engineering.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting because I'm in the middle of writing a course right now that I'm teaching at the university in a few weeks. So it's actually fascinating, like figuring out like what skill set, what would I want to learn if I were going back in this class right now. And it's basically, when I think about it now, it is basically an analytics engineering class. It's advanced SQL for like modern analytics. Right. But we go into because my company, we do data engineering, but the more I think about what we do, I would argue we're actually an analytics engineering firm because we engineer with the intent of enabling analytics and machine learning. It's the core of what we do. So when I think about the skill set, I mean, I would definitely weight pretty heavily the engineering part of it. Because I mean, if you take like the typical data scientist, I mean, the code is not production worthy at all. So just trying to be polite. So yeah, I would definitely figure out a way to to overweight on the engineering piece, but making it analytics applicable. And that's a lot of stuff for somebody to know. So Dylan's really good at this.
Thanks, Jeff. It's interesting coming back to kind of the data engineer versus analytics engineer, because Michael, kind of what you described for data engineer, writing Java, focus more on moving bytes. I mean, I think like modern, like you have to keep up with all the modern tools anyway. So like a lot of people that I know that identify as data engineers are learning all of those same tools, and like learning to leverage those tools to build pipelines instead of trying to build out the pipeline from the ground up.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like I think that analytics engineers will like eventually become maybe like a bigger group than data engineers were. Again, like, it sort of depends on how you define all these words, but like we're still going to need people to like, build Kafka, right, and like do a lot of that work, right? Which I think that feels like something that's data engineering-y and not necessarily analytics engineering-y. But as more of those things are abstracted and there's off-the-shelf tools that can just like handle a lot of that stuff for us, I think like more of the value is going to sit in the analytics engineering world, where it's about where does the business value come from? What is the business logic? How do we wire these different things together? Maybe it's like Python script here, little R library here. Like that sort of work, I think, is going to become more and more popular as the other sort of like core components of the infrastructure are abstracted and built into like SaaS platforms.
Yeah, I mean, you're already seeing this with machine learning. I mean, the machine learning engineer is the new term, and we do a fair bit of that as well. But I would say most of our work is what I would call analytics engineering. It's enabling analysts and BI teams with robust pipelines so they can do analytics. It's quite different from doing machine learning engineering, which, as you described earlier, is it's a complicated mess in itself. It's a different skill set to be a machine learning engineer versus an analytics engineer. We happen to be doing both, but like I said, I think the demand is more in the analytics engineering. I mean, we have this kind of like saying that most companies are barely doing BI, let alone AI, and I think there's a lot of weight to this. So I think your prediction on analytics engineering becoming popular is pretty sound.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate here. I think there's like two things that are working against like analytics engineers being a like really sustainable career path. The first in my mind is that some people are gonna, like, the people who become analytics engineers, in my experience, are people who are really curious and like want to learn a lot. And one of the things about being an analytics engineer is that you become like a function of a function of a function sort of thing. Like, let's say you're a company that sells widgets. You're not the person selling widgets. You're not the person helping make decisions on how to sell the widgets. You're the person helping the person who makes decisions about selling the widgets. Like, it's very removed. And I think like some people are gonna just feel like they're not actually having a huge like impact in their role, because so many of like what the analytics engineering things you do are so internal facing. And so I think we're going to see like a fair bit of churn from this role just because of the people that it attracts. And we've seen a lot, like Michael's no longer an analytics engineer. And, we can look at Stephen Levins, is that his surname? I think so, from Zapier, and Emily Shario from GitLab, who made an internal move, where these people who are like incredibly intelligent took on this role and then ended up like jumping out to another role. So I think that's going to be a thing that works against it. Another like factor that I see like limiting the like staying path of this career is the fact that good analytics engineering teams can be extremely effective with a very small number of people. And we see this a lot. Like, I think a really nice corollary here, or corollary, depending on which country you're in, is like really effective QA teams. In the past, like software engineering teams would have entire teams dedicated to manual QA. And now like most modern organizations sort of absorb that into like the functions of the actual software engineers. And so if each company has a smaller and smaller analytics team or data team in general, because they can be more effective, the opportunities to sort of become like a senior person, and if you're going on that manager path, I think are going to be a little harder to find. compared to like, say, a software engineering team where like there might be more people on it. So I don't know the answer. Like, and that's like scary to me because I'm a person that likes to have control over certain things. But those are some of the things that like in the back of my mind around the staying power of this career path.
Yeah,
those are incredibly good points.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting because it's a role that exists to fill gaps that are gaps because the world is bringing things closer together. Like you can now do so much more as an analyst with off-the-shelf tools. And there are still small gaps. You got to piece things together. But you used to have a data engineering team to have an analytics team. And now you kind of don't. You can get started with an analytics engineer and the skill set is it's a different bar. But it's easier to find those people. And I think you'll kind of you'll see that kind of coming together as those gaps continue to narrow.
One thing I was going to say is that I could see this being something like DevOps, where that is fundamentally like a service function, but it's one that's well compensated and it's one that's very valued. Just because you're not a feature engineer building like a user-facing product doesn't mean that there's no role for you at a company. Like DevOps has become a legitimate career path even as it's taken a while, and analytics engineering might follow a similar trajectory, although I do think it's quite likely that a lot of people will see it as like a stepping stone into like real engineering or like being a machine learning infrastructure engineer or something. It could go a lot of different ways, I think.
If the concept of data ops takes off, like it's been growing, I don't know if who has done some reading about it, but go and look up the term data ops, and it's applying DevOps principles, Lean, Six Sigma stuff into how we build pipelines and how we're understanding the data flows within our environments. And I think that if we can push that as a core tenet to what we're trying to build and the type of systems that we're building, then the analytics engineer is going to have a much easier time, because there's just going to be so much easier flowing of data and accessibility of data and cleanliness of data. It's going to enable the data engineering teams to staff less and have better visibility into what's going on with the couple of pipes that they maintain, and then move the rest to the business units and provide them with accessibility of data.
Yeah, I definitely recommend anyone who hasn't seen it, check out the Data Ops Cookbook. It is a very good resource on this.
It's a great way to think about data.
All right, I want to, because we're at the hour here, I want to thank everyone for coming and hanging out. This felt like a really interesting conversation. I'd love to, sort of talk with all of y'all. I'm always available on Slack, so send me a message if you ever want to chat. And we should definitely do this again, because this felt really productive. It felt like we raised a lot of really interesting points. And I definitely learned something. Hopefully all of y'all did as well. But that's all that I have for now. I have to go, but Caitlin probably does too, but y'all should, join a Zoom or keep Zooming or keep chatting about this stuff, write about it, share it. I think, through this group, we can sort of continue pushing this forward and continue pushing people's thinking. And that's a thing that's really exciting for me. So I've got to go, but thank y'all all very much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Caitlin,
thank you. This
for
is
organizing.
amazing.
Thanks,
Michael.